could benefit and sort of use international water law for a successful implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative. The whole idea for using, so connecting international water law and Belt and Road Initiative, well, it's because of the many rivers that China shares with its neighbors, whether, for instance, in Central Asia or on the Mekong part. Now, I chose Central Asia as a case study for various reasons, mainly that there are actual problems there that require solution, and that there are several different situations or case studies that could be used. So based on that, I tried to figure out to choose two different case or situations to see how, let's say, international water law can be used and somehow help the Belt and Road Initiative, meaning how, in this case, international law or sort of help, but also how international water law and the Belt and Road Initiative can interact together. So this is more or less the idea of the chapter. And so we start. I have, I guess, 20 minutes, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we go with an introduction. Time is, okay. So there is a huge amount of literature on the topic concerning international water law, transboundary water governance, and the role of any state in that. This literature has been emerging for the last 30, 40 years. In the meanwhile, international water law has been developing in the context of an extremely more complicated transboundary water governance. This is mainly because of states' inability to manage the shared water in a very constructive way for various reasons, which we're not going to get here into that, mainly the idea of first state sovereignty. So all that has been happening for the last few decades. And it has been happening globally, everywhere. It's even more complicated when we discuss about transboundary aquifers, for instance. This kind of interplay can also be seen in Central Asia. We have several countries in Central Asia that share transboundary water resources across several different basins there. These basins had different rules that were initially made from the Soviet era. They were unsuitable to address the sharing of water, but and they kept going despite the new rules that were adopted right now. So we are in a situation now there where we have rules that are inadequate for the sharing of water resources. So this is more or less the idea. As for the background, Central Asia is surrounded by strong countries, mainly China and Russia, meaning in the context of water resources, we have what we call water hegemons or hegemons. So especially, for instance, in the case of China, where China is upstream, when you consider that China shares, let's say, surface water with Kazakhstan, where China is an upstream country, giving it a stronger position. So all these both countries affect water resources and other issues as well in the region. In this case, China has absolutely important interest when it comes to Central Asia. That is one of the flagship projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. So in that chapter, I was trying to figure out the following, and that's the question I tried to answer. Could China push countries that are members of BRI to pursue cooperation over transboundary fresh waters on the basis of international water law? So there are several components of this question, and we're going to try to go through them in the next 15 minutes or so. So my idea is, or the question here is, how would interaction between BRI, international water law, A, help the countries where the shared water resources must be managed, and B, help China through BRI to become a legitimate player in this kind of regions? So that's more or less the idea. So water management in the context of BRI. China has obviously started trying to benefit from the fact that we have plenty of mineral resources outside China. These mineral resources are within countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, including Central Asia. Now, when it comes to water resources, this is an extremely sensitive topic because it's essential for survival of any nation. And so it has to be seen how China's approach to this would affect BRI, because countries are like they're extremely sensitive when it comes to their water resources, national or international, and they usually don't allow any country to intervene in that unless they have to do so when they in the context of shared resources. But in the general sense, China will play a role because BRI is indeed expected to affect natural resources management and the environment in the countries where it's being established. Indeed, in places in Sri Lanka or in Africa, already we could see that BRI has affected in the environment there, where you had many cases and disputes. Some locals have accused Chinese companies of not really respecting environmental protection, causing environmental damages, and creating victims. So, but in the context of BRI, this has been still relatively new. So we will have to see how this will go. Now, there is, again, on this context, there is an emerging literature where some scholars are saying that potentially China may lead, if China gets involved in the management of transboundary water resources, this potentially may lead to China taking control over these resources, similarly to like situations where in Sri Lanka, China took over control of ports there because, for instance, the Sri Lankan government was not able to pay the debts after taking the loans from the Chinese government. So it's not yet sure whether this is going to take place. I guess it depends on the level of the development in the country and their governance abilities and the rule of law, but we'll see in the future whether that will happen or not. So in a way, and given the importance of freshwater resources, one might even argue that it plays a very important role in the successful implementation of the initiative. So again, if we want to ask the question, how would Chinese policies in the context of Belt and Road initiatives affect transboundary water issues? Before we go there, we should make a little bit of a background concerning international water law. So international water law has been developing for the last 40, 50 years. It has binding and non-binding instruments. Mainly, there are two global conventions: the 1997 Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourse, and the 1992 Convention, the Helsinki Convention, also that was regional and they became global. So we have two global conventions on international or addressing surface water and groundwater to various degrees and scopes. And then we have one non-binding instrument, which is the 2008 draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers that mainly address transboundary groundwater resources, and it's not binding. So what's the entire purpose of international water law? Basically preventing conflicts between states and preventing unilateral measures over shared water resources in a way that states are more sort of encouraged and incentivized to cooperate rather than creating conflicts and managing unilateral water resources that are shared. So states have to provide their consent, and based on states' consent, transboundary water agreements are being created at the transboundary level on the basis of international water law. So that's how the entire idea of how international water law would interact several legal aspects or from a legal basis with BRI came from, or at least the thinking of it. And this is mainly because of the approach adopted from China when it comes to BRI, which based on the flexibility and pragmatism adopted by Beijing when it comes to the legal means to be adopted for the implementation of BRI. So, and the idea is to use these kind of flexible and pragmatic approaches to ensure the adequacy of BRI and more or less its effectiveness through its successful implementation. So this is why there is this kind of room in which somehow, legally speaking, BRI interacts with international law, in this case, international water law. So we get to the case study, which is Central Asia. So what are the problems in Central Asia? First of all, Central Asia is shared between 5 to 6 countries. You have Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, and few other countries that share the water resources there. Some of them are upstream, others are downstream. Water are not divided equally between these countries, and each of these countries have different interests, be it using water, for instance, for irrigation, for energy production, for other means as well. So it's different. And all these needs are competing together. But China has an interest in that region in the world where they are investing a lot using the Belt and Road Initiative. So the idea is that China should create a strategic framework sort of to collaborate between these countries in the context of the Belt and Road Initiatives to ensure successful water management. In a way, the idea is that China, since it's a hegemon in that area or in that part of the world, could, through the Belt and Road Initiative, push Central Asian countries to establish new water agreements and implement them in a certain way to ensure that the water resources there are well managed. So that's more or less the idea. So it's borderline law and not law, where we're trying to use the hegemon of the region, which is China, to push international law on the region. And in the same time, regional law, because these countries have to create transboundary water agreements. So, as I said before, there are two case studies or two situations I identified in the paper or in the chapter. The first case or situation is when China shares directly water resources with the countries in Central Asia. So China, for instance, shares a lot of rivers with Kazakhstan, which is one of the countries of the region. More precisely, we have 24 rivers shared between China and Kazakhstan. The main two rivers are the Irtysh and the Li rivers. Now, legal cooperation between both countries have been happening, especially in the last couple of decades, or I would say 3 decades in this regard. And it's actually well done in the sense that you've got water agreements, you have joint institutions, although there were delays in the implementation of the agreements, especially from the side of Kazakhstan, due to the lack of capacity and technical expertise in the field. So this is why one would say the Belt and Road Initiative could present more of another step for solving the problems and for the well management of water resources between both countries. So when we discuss, as I said, there are many agreements. The main agreement is the agreement between Kazakhstan and China on cooperation and use or protection of transboundary rivers. It was signed in 2001. Now, after that, this is a framework agreement. After that, many other agreements were adopted on, let's say, water quality and other issues. But this is the main agreement adopted between China and Kazakhstan. Now, this agreement included directly and indirectly international water principles. What are these principles? A principle of equitable, reasonable utilization, meaning states or nations have to share the water in an equitable and reasonable manner. B, idea of preventing significant harm, and the concept of cooperation. Why this is significant? Well, in a way, the fact that these principles are included within the conventions is a sign that China plays in accordance with international water rules. This is extremely important because China did not sign the existing water conventions for different reasons, mainly the fact that they did not agree on the concept of limited sovereignty. Within this agreement, at least with Kazakhstan, China is stating directly that they are part of the international water community, even though they did not sign international water agreements. So they're adopting sort of flexible approach to these kind of issues. So China used these principles within the agreements, and these principles have to be also applicable in the context of BRI, in the sense that if China is going to make investments, is already making investments with Kazakhstan over the shared water resources in the context of BRI, they have to respect these international water principles, even though China is not a member, is not a party to international water conventions. And these principles can also be used elsewhere. So since we have 18 transboundary rivers between China and Kazakhstan, these principles can be used in these 18 transboundary rivers but as well as between China and other countries with whom China shares rivers. So in a way, there is an opening for China, who is not willing to be part of international water law in terms of at least becoming party to the agreement. There's an opening through which China can apply international water law without being bound by international water law. That way, there is not too much pressure on China to be bound by international water conventions, but at the same time, providing sufficient room to the country to apply these rules, which what it seems that China is doing, especially when one considers China's idea of one country, one treaty. So this is the first case study, or the first situation, where China shares natural resources or water resources with another country, where Beijing is doing substantial investments concerning these water resources in the context of BRI. Now, the second situation is where China is only making investments or seeking to invest. So China is not sharing water resources with any of the countries. We also take, in this case, the situation of Central Asia, or Central Asia as a case study. So the main agreement governing shared water resources in Central Asia is the agreement on cooperation in joint management, use, and protection of water resources. That agreement was adopted in the 90s. So it was created by 5 countries. It's voluntary between the countries, so to apply it. And the idea, the main objectives are the regulation of water allocation, protection of shared fresh waters, and avoiding water disputes. Now, this legal regime, so this is the first agreement. Keep in mind that on the basis of this agreement, numerous other agreements were adopted over the years until now. This agreement is considered as a framework convention, while the other ones are not framework conventions. But all these agreements have been criticized because they still sort of, despite the forward looking towards international water law to include the principles of international water law within these agreements, at the same time, they still had substantial elements from the Soviet Union regulations that were used for regulating Central Asia's water resources. So they were also criticized. Now, despite the fact that we have institutions and we have agreements, countries failed to deal with water tensions. The main problems is you have competition, as I said before, between countries. Upstream countries like Kazakhstan want to use water resources for energy generation. Downstream countries want to use water for irrigation, and hydropower, and they are using it for only for irrigation. So there's different competing needs when water must be open to allow water flow from upstream to downstream countries, and they're not agreeing on that. And this, despite the fact that all the countries agree that water resources must be managed in a very good way, but it's not happening. And that did not happen, even though many Central Asian countries signed or ratified international water conventions. So we are in a situation where the current legal framework concerning water resources in Central Asia is not working. We need a new legal framework. Now, given that China is making substantial investments in Central Asia, potentially China could again play the role of a hegemon there, but from a neutral perspective, due to the investments made, especially when it comes to natural resources there, pushing Central Asian countries to establish, ratify, and actually implement successfully water conventions addressing specific basins. That's a role that China can play from a neutral perspective in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's the conclusion? Transboundary waters are a very important component of Belt and Road initiatives and to its success, given the importance of water resources everywhere. So, and given that China is doing a lot of substantial investments concerning water resources. So it's a way, in a way, China could, let's say, ride the wave of being the neutral, responsible power through which it can push towards the successful and good management of shared fresh waters through the investments that are being made by BRI, all the while staying outside. outside. So this is what, and since international water law offers an appropriate legal framework, this kind of interplay between international water law, BRI, in the context of shared basins, water basins, could actually lead to a situation where these basins are effectively managed. And that's the entire presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks indeed, Imad. Thanks indeed.